On December 26, 2004, the ocean floor near the northern tip of Sumatra, Indonesia, began to move. Not gradually, not slowly. It snapped violently.
A tsunami in western Indonesia has claimed 113 lives so far.
And without warning, along a fault line that stretched for 1,600 kilometers beneath the Indian Ocean.
Tidak ada orang yang selamat, hanya 2 orang. Ada bawahnya, coba deh, cium bawah.
Within 15 minutes, the coastlines of northern Indonesia were already being consumed by walls of water that nobody had seen coming and nobody had any way to stop.
And then...
Within 90 minutes, the beaches of Thailand, still full of tourists enjoying the day after Christmas, were hit with the same force. Within 2 hours, Sri Lanka and India were underwater.
I'm standing right next to the coastline here in Colombo. The seas moved in very, very quickly.
Within 7 hours, the wave had crossed the entire Indian Ocean and reached the eastern coastline of Africa, Somalia, Tanzania, Kenya, countries that had nothing to do with the earthquake, thousands of kilometers away, still devastated. By the time the energy from that single morning finished crossing the planet, nearly 230,000 people were dead across 14 separate countries. But here is what most people never talk about when they talk about the 2004 Indian Ocean disaster. The tsunami, as catastrophic as it was not even the most unthinkable part of what happened that morning, because the earthquake that caused it was so incomprehensibly violent, so massive in scale, that it didn't just destroy coastlines and end lives. It physically altered the planet we live on. It moved the Earth itself. And we are going to get into exactly what that means. But before we do, we need to go back to the morning of December 26 and understand what was building beneath the ocean long before any of us were alive. The Indian Ocean sits above one of the most geologically active regions on Earth. Beneath its surface, 2 enormous tectonic plates, the Indian Plate and the Burma Plate, have been in a slow, grinding collision for millions of years. The Indian Plate moving northward, pushing relentlessly beneath the Burma Plate in a process geologists call subduction. This is not a fast process. It happens at roughly the speed your fingernails grow, a few centimeters per year. But over millions of years, that pressure accumulates into something almost impossible to comprehend. The Burma Plate locks against the Indian Plate. Friction holds them in place while the force behind them keeps building. The overriding plate bends. It bulges. It strains under pressure that has nowhere to go. And then it lets go. On December 26, 2004, the fault line ruptured along nearly the entire 1,600-kilometer length, starting near the northern tip of Sumatra and tearing northward at roughly 2.8 kilometers per second. The rupture lasted between 8 and 10 minutes, one of the longest ever recorded in modern seismology. During those minutes, sections of the Burma Plate lurched upward by as much as 15 meters. The seafloor, the actual bottom of the Indian Ocean, was suddenly displaced across a zone hundreds of kilometers wide, and sitting directly above all that was 30 cubic kilometers of ocean water. When the seafloor moves that much, that fast, the water above it has no choice but to move with it. And that displacement, that sudden violent movement of 30 cubic kilometers of ocean, is what created the tsunami. The earthquake measured between 9.1 and 9.3 in magnitude, the third most powerful ever recorded in human history. The energy it released was equivalent to more than twice the total explosive energy used by every single weapon deployed during all of World War II. Every bomb, every shell, every explosive device across 6 years of global warfare combined, more than doubled in under 10 minutes. Now, here is where this earthquake moves from catastrophic into something else entirely. When a fault line ruptures and enormous sections of the Earth's crust shift position, the mass distribution of the planet changes. Not by much, but enough. Enough that the physics governing the rotation of the Earth are affected. Think of a figure skater pulling their arms inward during a spin. As their mass moves closer to the center of rotation, they spin faster. The same principle applies to the Earth. When the tectonic plates shifted on December 26, 2004, mass was redistributed toward the Earth's axis of rotation, and as a result, the planet sped up. up. The earthquake didn't just shorten that one day, it permanently changed the baseline speed of the planet's rotation, shortening every day that came after it by 2.68 microseconds. NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory confirmed it. The Earth has been spinning fractionally faster ever since December 26, 2004. That is not a metaphor. That is not an exaggeration. Physicists at NASA calculated it. The earthquake stole time from an entire day. And that was not the only planetary effect. The sheer violence of the rupture also caused the Earth to wobble on its rotational axis, shifting it by nearly 2.5 centimeters. The geographic North Pole moved, slightly, imperceptibly to anyone standing on the surface, but it moved. The entire Earth physically altered by a single geological event that lasted less than 10 minutes. Now take everything you just learned about the force behind this earthquake and picture it being transferred into the ocean above it. In deep ocean water, a tsunami is nearly invisible. A ship sailing directly over one would barely feel it pass. The wave is incredibly long, sometimes hundreds of kilometers from crest to crest. But in deep water, it is also very low. A broad, almost imperceptible swell moving at roughly 800 kilometers per hour, close to the cruising speed of a commercial jetliner. There is nothing to see, nothing to feel, nothing to warn you. The destruction is traveling, carrying an almost incomprehensible amount of kinetic energy across thousands of kilometers of open ocean, invisible, waiting for the moment the water becomes shallow. Because the moment a tsunami enters shallow water, everything changes. As the depth decreases, the wave slows. But the energy it carries does not disappear. It has nowhere to go except upward. The wave compresses. It builds. It stacks on top of itself. What was half a meter tall in the open ocean becomes 10 meters, 20 meters. In some locations on December 26, the waves that hit the coastline were measured at 30 meters, nearly 100 feet tall, moving inland at speeds that left no time to run and no time to survive. And unlike a normal ocean wave that crashes and recedes, a tsunami is a sustained surge, a continuous push of water that keeps moving inland for minutes at a time, carrying everything with it before pulling back and dragging everything into the ocean. The pull back killed nearly as many people as the initial surge. In Banda Aceh, the closest major city to the epicenter, the waves arrived within 15 to 20 minutes of the earthquake. There was no warning, no siren, no instruction of any kind. People who were still trying to understand what the earthquake had done looked up and saw the water coming and had seconds to decide which direction to run. Approximately 170,000 Indonesians died that morning. In some coastal villages near Banda Aceh, the survival rate was close to zero. Entire communities, generations of families, entire ways of life erased in under an hour. In Thailand, the beaches were full of tourists enjoying the holiday. Before the tsunami arrived, something strange happened on the shoreline. The water receded dramatically and rapidly, exposing the seafloor for hundreds of meters. Fish were left flapping on wet sand. Some people ran immediately. Others walked toward it curious, taking photographs, completely unaware of what was coming. The wave arrived within minutes. More than 5,000 people died. A significant number of them were foreign tourists, meaning the death toll of December 26 was not only an Asian tragedy, it was a global one.
More than 23,000, and that number's likely to rise still further.
In Sri Lanka, the tsunami struck a passenger train called the Queen of the Sea, traveling along the coastal rail line, carrying an estimated 1,700 passengers. The first wave derailed the carriages. People climbed onto the roof to escape the water. The second wave swept the entire train off the tracks. Fewer than 150 passengers survived. It remains one of the deadliest rail disasters in recorded history, caused not by failure on the train, but by a wave generated 1,500 kilometers away that arrived without warning. The same wave, 14 countries, no warning, no time. By 2004, the technology to detect a tsunami like this one and warn coastal populations existed. It had existed for decades. The Pacific Ocean had been monitored by the DART system, pressure sensors on the ocean floor that detect the weight change of a passing tsunami, transmit the data to surface buoys, relay it to satellites, and deliver an alert to warning centers within minutes. 40 stations, decades of operational history, proven technology. The Indian Ocean had none of it. Not because the technology didn't exist, not because the threat wasn't known, but because the Indian Ocean had not experienced a major tsunami in living memory, and the political and financial will to build a warning system there had never materialized. Scientists detected the 9.1 magnitude earthquake within minutes of it occurring. They knew a tsunami had almost certainly been generated, but there was no established protocol, no contact list, no infrastructure to reach governments and emergency services fast enough to matter. Some scientists made individual phone calls, but by the time any warnings reached anyone in an official capacity, the waves had already arrived. Sri Lanka, India, and the East African nations had a window, however narrow, where warnings could have saved tens of thousands of lives. That window was never used because the infrastructure to use it did not exist. The weeks and months that followed December 26, 2004 represented one of the largest humanitarian responses in modern history. The scale of destruction was so total in some areas that international aid organizations struggled to even reach the affected populations. In Banda Aceh, roads and bridges had been destroyed. Airports were damaged. The infrastructure needed to deliver aid was the same infrastructure the tsunami had taken out.
The next days, weeks, and months will push forward to provide aid and comfort.
Within weeks, governments and private citizens around the world had pledged over $14 billion in aid to affected countries. It was, at the time, the largest outpouring of international humanitarian assistance ever recorded. But the recovery was not clean or fast. It was complicated, painful, and in many ways is still ongoing. In Indonesia, the reconstruction of Aceh province took years. Hundreds of thousands of people had lost not just their homes, but their livelihoods. Fishing boats, farming land, small businesses, all gone. The psychological trauma, the grief of losing entire families, entire communities, entire ways of life, is not something that gets rebuilt with aid money. Survivors describe the years after the tsunami as a kind of extended disorientation. The physical landscape of their communities had changed so completely that returning to the coast felt like arriving in a foreign place. Landmarks they had known their entire lives were gone. Graveyards were gone. In some places, the coastline itself had physically changed. Land that had existed before December 26 was now beneath the ocean. In Thailand, the beaches of Khao Lak and Phuket were rebuilt and reopened relatively quickly. Memorials were built. Warning systems were installed. But the communities of local fishing people who had lived on those beaches for generations and who had lost the most received far less attention and far fewer resources than the tourist infrastructure around them. This disparity became one of the defining criticisms of the entire international recovery effort. And then there was the question that had hung over everything since the morning of December 26 itself. How do we make sure this never happens again? In January 2005, the United Nations convened the World Conference on Disaster Reduction in Kobe, Japan. The 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami was the central subject. Representatives from governments around the world gathered to discuss what had failed, what needed to change, and what commitment they were willing to make. The outcome was the Hyogo Framework for Action, a global agreement on disaster risk reduction. And specifically on the question of tsunami warning systems, nations agreed that the Indian Ocean would get what the Pacific had. By 2006, just 2 years after the disaster, the Indian Ocean Tsunami Warning System was operational. Stations positioned across the ocean floor, connected to seismic sensors, tide gauges, and satellite communication systems capable of reaching emergency management agencies across all at-risk countries within minutes of a detection. Today, the global tsunami warning infrastructure spans the Pacific, the Indian Ocean, the Caribbean, and portions of the Atlantic. Warning centers staffed around the clock, systems that share data across national boundaries. It is not perfect. There are still coastlines without adequate warning infrastructure. There are still communities that lack the education and preparedness to respond effectively, even when a warning is issued. But the world that exists today, in terms of tsunami detection and warning capability, is fundamentally different from the world that existed on December 25, 2004. December 26 changed that. 230,000 people, 14 countries, one morning. An earthquake so powerful it ruptured 1,600 kilometers of ocean floor, released more energy than every weapon used in World War II combined, moved the planet by 2.5 centimeters, and shortened the length of a day.
The largest earthquake in 40 years has devastated large parts of southern Asia.
A tsunami that was invisible in the open ocean and catastrophic at the coastline that killed people in Indonesia, Sri Lanka, Thailand, India, and East Africa, all within the same 7 hours. And a warning system that didn't exist, that could have existed, that would have saved tens of thousands of lives if the world had simply chosen to build it before rather than after. The 2004 Indian Ocean earthquake and tsunami is not just a story about natural disaster. It is a story about what happens when the Earth reminds us violently, without warning and without mercy, exactly how small we are. And it is a story about what human beings chose to do in the aftermath. The billions raised, the systems built, the agreements signed, the infrastructure created, so that the next time the ocean floor moves, and it will move again, someone, somewhere will have enough time to run. If this story hit you the way it hit me researching it, you already know what to do.